The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague.
Welcome to the Books Podcast. I'm Tim Hague. As you know, we are rather pleased to occasionally touch on subjects far removed from any intellectual competence to which I might pretend, such as science. Recent interviews have included Lawrence Krauss and Marcus Chown. They're well worth a listen. Please do subscribe now on your favourite podcasts and tell your friends. Robin Choudhury is a bona fide and highly distinguished practicing cardiologist and is in fact Professor of Cardiovascular Medicine at Oxford University. We're very excited to be with him here at his publishers, Head of Zeus. He's written, perhaps inevitably, a book, no, not a book, the book, about the human heart, what it means, how it works, what it's for.
The heart as a repository of deeds, or the seat of the soul, or the source of love, and remarkably even the source of semen, in some ways of thinking, was shared across cultures. After she died, the heart was removed and the nuns incised the heart, and there what did they find? But Christ on the cross and all of the paraphernalia of the crucifixion were all there inside St. Chiara's heart.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Robin, thank you for joining us on Books Podcast.
Tim, it's great to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
This is a sumptuous book. It's lavishly illustrated. Head of Zeus have really gone to town for you. What it's not, though, it's not a coffee table book, is it? It's a lot more than that.
Yes, I agree. The publishers have been fantastic, and they've really got into the spirit of this book, which is, in a sense, a cultural history told through depictions of the heart. And I straplined it Botticelli to Banksy, in a sense, because that's what it is. It covers a whole spectrum of illustration, really extending beyond Botticelli back to the ancient Egyptians. And the images are beautiful, and they're lavish in their original creation, and Head of Zeus has done a great job in reproducing them, I think.
But you've got a lot more to tell. You've got a lot of story to tell. There are really two subjects here, aren't there? What the heart is and what it means, which, of course, they're inextricably bound up with each other. But I think the sort of the central point that you're making is that the heart has always occupied a place of central significance culturally in our apprehension of our own humanity. It sounds obvious because that's how we think of it, but it's not, is it? There's no reason it should be.
Well, I think that's right. And this, in a sense, is my own exploration of exactly that question. So I decided to become a cardiologist, a heart doctor, when I was in my teenage. And this is a much later exploration of why I, and it turns out many other people across the ages, have held the heart in the regard that they have and afforded it many of the properties that they have, which it turned out have been shared across lots of cultures and lots of different ages.
You go into that, yeah. You make that all cultures seem to see it as like the seat of not human, well, yes, human life, but also human personality or personhood almost. I mean, we get a short list. I mean, you go into it in beautiful detail. Do the Egyptians, where the heart is the site of the mind, thought, memory, will, intention. It's what the person is for the Egyptians. And we got Anubis, of course, in Egyptian mythology, weighs the heart against a feather to see whether you're going to be fed to the crocodile god because your heart is heavier than the feather. But you also, the Upanishads, you do the Aztecs, and you go to China. It's always the heart, which we're so used to that we don't think about it.
Right, and early on in the book, so you're really surveying the first chapter, I wanted to get an idea of quite how pervasive these ideas of the heart were. And what emerged was also the idea that it was not only pervasive, but there were shared characteristics or shared attributes. And that was really startling to me, to learn that the heart is a repository of deeds, or the seat of the soul, or the source of love, and remarkably even the source of semen, in some ways of thinking, was shared across cultures. And that was really quite a discovery, if you like, as I undertook this research. And then the book goes on to develop some of those ideas, as you know, and to try and work out why. And why was it that when Aristotle lifted a flap in the roof of a fertilized egg and saw the heart beating there as the first moving structure, that he attached to that significance as the heart, as the originator of life. And that strand of the beating heart and of the attributes people that have tagged on to the heart is something that I try to draw through the book.
Well, that's right, isn't there? Because there is a narrative of discovery, starting, as you say, with... we're going to do a bit more about Aristotle, because what you tell us in the book is that he actually created a little window into an egg early on in the development of a fowl, some sort of bird, I suppose, and observed that the first organ was... And of course, he concluded from that, as everybody seems to, that the heart is the originator of life, is where life starts.
And I think if you try and get into Aristotle's mindset, it's hard to think anything else. Here you have, just on the stillness of a fertilized egg, this tiny red structure. It's one of the few things that would have colour, perhaps the only thing that would have colour. And there it starts to beat. And if you were looking for an origin of life, that would be a pretty certain place to start. And then, of course, he would have known from his own experience of the beating heart in passion and fear, but also from animal dissection or knowledge of animals in the slaughterhouse, that when the heart stops, the animal's dead and the animal goes cold. And that's another very important feature, that when the body's warm, the heart's beating, and when the heart stops, the body's cold and lifeless.
And so they concluded. Well, Galen, it goes back to Galen, doesn't it? Who and his ideas prevailed for 1,300 years. He was 2nd century, wasn't he, Galen?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, of course he was a physician to Marcus Aurelius. Of course, 2nd century. So, but it's then the Middle Ages before that notion of the heart creating the heat is dispensed. I mean, it's an incredibly powerful notion. It must have been very compelling.
Right, and I think that's a very fundamental observation, isn't it? And, you know, if you're trying to understand the world through unifying principles, as we do now, but certainly people were early on, you have a set of lenses through which you can see things. So you might be thinking in terms of planetary motion, or of heat generation and furnaces, or fast forward about pumps, still forward further about the generation of electricity, or forward to our own age and genes and molecules. So we see the world through certain prisms, and in a sense, the story of the heart is a cultural history of ideas and how people had seen the world more widely. But because the heart was so central to the way that they saw both secular and sacred life, it features very prominently. And then as scientific life comes into play, the heart's right there. And, you know, one of the remarkable things, we've already mentioned Aristotle, and I don't want to run too far ahead, but...
No, we do, because we're going to go into the narrative of discovery.
I mean, one of the amazing things to me was to realize that, you know, major thinkers who perhaps we know from other worlds, so Aristotle, Aquinas, Descartes, Leonardo da Vinci, had all been preoccupied with the heart and what the heart did. And Leonardo, I'm sure, we'll speak about, but Leonardo devoted page upon page of his notebooks.
Leonardo is one of the most interesting, one of the most interesting people in history, but he's also one of the most interesting people in the book. So yes, let's talk about him for a while. As you, I think most people know, he did a lot of anatomical drawings, and you know better than most of us how detailed his work on the heart was. And yet, I think you're slightly disappointed. He never published any of it.
Well, I'm both disappointed and exhilarated in a way that he was doing this incredible work on his own. Not quite on his own, but certainly unpublished.
Completely out of his time, though. I mean, he was wildly in advance, at least 100 years in advance of anybody else.
You're absolutely right. And I think, you know, it's easy to default to seeing Leonardo as a genius, and I really wanted to resist that lazy thinking. But when you look at what he did, it was really incredible. And perhaps what I hadn't realized was how far behind the line he'd had to start. So he'd inherited all of these ideas from Galen and the classical medical thinkers, often endorsed by the church, about how the body was meant to work. And his early drawings were really a representation of what he was reading. But over the course of about 25 years, absolutely remarkably, and as you rightly say, 100 years ahead of his time, he starts not only through his own dissection, but also through experimentation to work out what the heart does and how it works and what the various bits are for. And that I thought was remarkable, because he was doing it as a one-man show with one intellectual hand tied behind his back, and he wriggled free. And really, as a sort of exercise in Renaissance thinking and exposition, it was unmatched.
Well, you tell us, you make the point that up to the time of Leonardo, when people were doing anatomical discussions or handbooks for anybody who needed to know, who needed to learn about the heart, they tended not to have drawings in them. Leonardo actually looked and drew what he saw. Almost for the first time in history in this field.
Yes, that's right. And even where there were drawings, which did start sometime before Leonardo, they were so dry and so unenlightening about what they were meant to be showing as to be almost useless. And certainly for any sort of scientific thinking, they were really useless. Some of them were quite beautiful, and we've shown some of them.
And there are beautiful illustrations in the book, yeah.
But they're not usable. So we can think some of the earliest anatomical drawings from the Ashmolean manuscript 399 from the 12th century are they're probably among my favorite illustrations in the book, but they bear no relation to any sort of reality as we would see it, but they really are striking. And they're among the first scientific drawings, in the sense that they're not merely illuminations of manuscripts. They actually refer to something in the text. It's just that the text is so far wide of the mark.
Well, this is another point, isn't it? Because you say they don't bear any reality to what we know, and in some ways, from our perspective, some of these things look straightforward and obvious to us. But and this is something I hadn't really given enough thought to, but you do. The difficulty of dissection, the difficulty of actually getting to look at these things was prohibitive.
Yes, absolutely. So it's hard enough now when we have fixatives and preservatives to help, and well-chilled and air-conditioned rooms and so forth. But imagine what it would have been like to dissect a body in the tail end of the 15th century.
Because it's a messy business at the best
It's a
of
messy
times,
business absolutely messy and smelly business. And when you look at some of the beautiful anatomical depictions, you can't imagine how difficult it is to separate some of the tissues. They're adherent to each other, they're friable, they're easy to cut by mistake. So when we look at Leonardo's drawings and some of the later ones, Antonio Scarpa would be another really beautiful engraver, it's almost impossible to imagine how hard it is to get to that level of fine.
So it really
dissection.
is not fair of us when we look at the sort of pre-Leonardo drawings to think, well, we've got an illustration here which has the throat going straight into the heart. Well, how could they have thought that? It'd be really quite hard to find out that he didn't in those days.
Yes, and I think quite a lot of that anatomical drawing was done as a combination of what was written in the texts and perhaps some quite cursory examination in a butcher's yard, or to get some idea of what the heart looked like, but there was no sense in which it was faithful dissection and representation.
A century later than Leonardo, we get the big breakthrough. I mean, it's the fulcrum of this whole discipline, really, isn't it? Which is William Harvey discovering the circulation of blood. What did people think happened before that?
Well, before that, and you'd mentioned Galen, the Galenic synthesis was what everybody believed in terms of what the blood and the blood vessels were for. And in essence, the blood was made in the liver, and then it went through the arteries and also through the veins to the peripheries, and it was consumed. So there was no notion of blood going round in a circuit at all.
So it was dispersed around the body, and the various organs used it.
Exactly. And then the liver made some more. And that mattered because a lot of the few therapeutic interventions that there were, bloodletting was one of them. So the idea that you could take away some of the bad blood and the liver would make some new blood.
Because, of course, Galen worked on these humours, didn't he? Phlegm,
Absolutely.
bile, and blood. Yes, so letting out the bad blood would be good medicine.
Yes, and London medicine and where we're sitting is not far from the epicenter of 17th century London medicine, would have been preoccupied with bloodletting. So Harvey comes along and says, actually, it's not quite as you all think. The blood goes round and round, and it would have been very destabilizing. For us, it's an obvious and positive development, but to his colleagues, it would have been quite threatening.
And what clued him in? What gave him the insight?
Well, a number of things. I mean, what was remarkable about Harvey was he didn't have any new kit, didn't have any new machines. He wasn't using a microscope or anything like that for the first time. He just stripped it back to the first principles. So, for instance, he realized that if you cut an artery in an animal in a slaughterhouse, the blood comes out so quickly that it couldn't possibly be made by the liver. But actually, when he was asked himself, what was the key discovery? It was the valves in the veins. So when he was working in Padua with Fabricius, they wrote a treatise on the veins and the valves that ensure unidirectional flow of blood. So he realized that the veins couldn't be taking blood to the peripheries because of the orientation of the valves. They had to be taking it back to the heart. And then he twigged that the arteries were taking the blood away from the heart and the veins were taking the blood back to the heart. But it took him 9 years before he had the bottle.
And it frightened him, didn't he? He
He
wasn't keen.
And when he writes about it, he writes to his colleagues, I've shown you all of this. You're all in on this. He sort of spreads the blame for his great discovery.
So different from the present day where everybody's rushing to publish their discovery and try to be first.
Completely. Yeah, absolutely.
So let's locate William Harvey. He's early 17th century. I think his book on the motions of the heart, you say, is 1628, which you say is the single most important treatise in the history of medicine. That's not just a cardiologist talking.
Well, I mean, obviously I'm speculating a bit, but if you think that all of medicine, all of surgery, all of therapeutics requires an understanding of the blood, the flow of blood, the circulation of blood, I think it's hard to think of anything that's more important, even something like the double helix and the description of the structure of the gene, which would be right up there. But really underpinning everything is the fact that the blood goes round and round and carries oxygen.
This is the same time, of course, that Descartes is disagreeing with Harvey, and Descartes is wrong about the function of the heart and the operation of the heart.
Well, Descartes was, in simple terms, I think, more interested in the brain as the powerhouse, if you like. And Descartes thought that the heart was a muscle, and that muscle, which indeed it is, but he thought that all muscles were under the control of the brain. And in the case of the heart, that's absolutely not the case.
Because that's the point about the heart. And the reason it's been so important historically is that it's autonomous. It's not subject to the will, to the intention of the brain that's controlling or not controlling it.
Well, I think that's absolutely right, because we have this autonomous thing living inside of us, seemingly sentient, and reporting back to us that this is a time of peril or of passion or of love or of intensity of some sort. And it's that relationship between this seemingly autonomous thing inside us and us that is so important to the beating of the heart. So in turn, the question of how does it beat for itself is something that hangs in the ether for centuries.
I have to admit that passage in the book where you explain how the heart beats autonomously was over my pay grade. That I found was the one part of the book I wasn't really secure on. But you do at least explain to brighter people than me how it can be the case.
In essence, even if the scientific, as it were, description, which I've tried to make comprehensible to non-scientists, is not quite, you haven't quite grasped it on the first read through. I think the message that we really had to wait until the 20th century, even though there was this enormous pregnancy in terms of desperately wanting to know how the heart beat for itself, it was just impossible. And it wasn't until we could measure electricity and indeed think in terms of electricity, and that we could harness the power of early computation, that Dennis Noble, Professor Dennis Noble, was able, as a graduate student in his early 20s, to unpick this question of the ages that had really fascinated Aristotle and Aquinas and Descartes, as we've said. They'd all posed the question, how does it beat for itself? And Dennis Noble was the person that unpicked it. And actually, regardless of the scientific mechanism, actually the thrilling thing about speaking to him, which is the account that I give in the book, was not merely to understand the science, but to try and get into his brain. Did he know that when he was 20 in 1960 in Bloomsbury, just yards from where we're speaking, that he'd unpicked this question of the ages and that in some important sense had uncovered a secret of the origin of life? And that was a really fun conversation to have.
We do need to talk, because you go much wider than just the anatomy and even physiology, into the significance, the cultural significance of the heart. And I'm not sure how we're going to start off by getting it, but I want to start off with Christian iconography, because one of the interesting things is that while there are sort of formalized images of hearts, with Christian imagery, and especially the sort of cult of the Sacred Heart, they're luridly realistic, fleshy objects, organs, in all of these highly pious paintings. And that again, we're used to it, because every time we go into a Catholic church, we see a Sacred Bleeding Heart or something. It actually is a slightly counterintuitive. You'd think that they would want to pretty it up.
Yeah, I completely agree with that analysis. And I would have thought, I might have imagined, that the Sacred Heart would be something softer and somehow holy, and we'd be protected from some of those more carnal influences. But it's just as you say, particularly in the cult of the Sacred Heart in the Catholic tradition, they are these fleshy, bleeding, anatomical hearts. And I hadn't known how that came to pass. And one of the really interesting things in this detective trail was finding the image where that starts. And it's in the frontispiece of a book, which is in turn a declaration of a vision that was had by St. Mary Alacoque, who was one of the founders of this relatively modern tradition of the Sacred Heart.
I mean, of course, it's not just her who has this notion of the heart. You reproduce a painting of Botticelli's showing the Ignatius of Antioch's. After he's dead, because he said, this is it. He said, "I have Christ's name written on my heart," and according to legend, this was literally true. So Botticelli paints a couple of blokes cutting him open, taking the heart out and carving it in half to have a look.
Yes, and Botticelli's smart, isn't he? Because he doesn't know what to do at this point. He doesn't know what the heart does, and he doesn't know what that would have looked like. So he paints this beautiful image of these two men in their glorious robes with a scimitar in hand, incising the heart and looking expectantly in it, but Botticelli doesn't show us what's inside. So, and I think that, there are lots of ideas about, how the heart might have been a repository, in that case for the gold letters. There's a whole other...
Saint Chiara.
Absolutely.
I forget where she was a saint of. But yes, Christ dwells in my heart. So what did they do? What did the nuns do after her death?
After she died, the heart was removed and the nuns incised the heart. And there, what did they find? But Christ on the cross and all of the paraphernalia of the crucifixion were all there inside St. Chiara's heart. And it's all laid out. And there are various images, sometimes where there's a literal inventory of all the things that were found inside St. Chiara's heart. And then sometimes there's a much more literal depiction where St. Chiara's got the cross, life-size cross, 10 feet high, piercing her chest and going into the heart. So it's open to a little bit of
A
interpretation.
lot of these painters had very literal imagination.
They did.
So, that is Robin Choudhury, The Beating Heart, which is published by Head of Zeus at £35. And I thought it was lovely. I mean, it was a wonderful read and a beautiful book to look at. Robin, thank you very much.
Tim, thank you. What a pleasure to speak with you.
If you've enjoyed this interview, please subscribe now on your favourite podcast player to be notified of upcoming episodes.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.